The hunger had become so familiar that Greta Schneider sometimes forgot what it felt like to be truly full. In the winter of 1944, serving as a radio operator for the Wehrmacht communications unit stationed outside Brussels, she had grown accustomed to the gnawing emptiness that never quite left her stomach. The official rations had been cut 3 times that year. Breakfast was ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and a single slice of dark bread that seemed to contain more sawdust than grain. Lunch, when it came at all, might be a thin soup with a few floating vegetable scraps. Dinner was whatever could be scrounged or bartered from the dwindling supplies that reached their unit through increasingly disrupted supply lines. She wasn't alone in her hunger. All 53 women in her communications unit had learned to cinch their belts tighter, to ignore the constant rumbling in their bellies, to stop talking about food because it only made the emptiness worse. They had been told this was their sacrifice for the fatherland, that soldiers on the front lines had it far worse, that German women were strong enough to endure anything for victory. Greta had believed it once. She had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, filled with patriotic fervor and genuine belief that she was serving a righteous cause. Her father had been a small-town baker in Bavaria, and she had grown up surrounded by the warm smell of fresh bread and the comfort of full meals shared around a family table. Those memories seemed to belong to another lifetime now. When the American forces swept through Belgium in early 1945, Greta's unit had no chance to retreat. They were captured without a shot being fired, rounded up by American soldiers who seemed almost embarrassed by how easy it had been. The women had expected the worst. Nazi propaganda had filled their heads with horror stories about American brutality, about how female prisoners would be abused, starved, worked to death. Instead, they were loaded onto trucks with surprising gentleness and given canteens of clean water for the journey. Greta didn't trust it. Kindness, she had learned, was usually just the prelude to cruelty. She clutched her small canvas bag containing everything she still owned in the world: a single change of clothes, a photograph of her family, and a diary she had somehow managed to keep throughout the war. As the truck rumbled toward an unknown destination, she pressed her hand against her empty stomach and wondered if she would ever feel truly satisfied again. The journey across the Atlantic had taken 11 days aboard a converted cargo ship that rolled and pitched through winter storms. The German women prisoners were kept in a converted hold below deck, sleeping on canvas bunks stacked 3 high. They were given bread, tinned meat, and water twice daily, more food than Greta had seen in months, though she still couldn't bring herself to trust it. The other women whispered among themselves in the darkness, speculating about their fate. Would they be put to work in factories, sent to labor camps, simply locked away until the war ended? No one knew, and the American sailors who brought their meals spoke no German and seemed content to leave them in uncertainty. When the ship finally docked in Boston Harbor on March 18, 1945, Greta's legs trembled as she climbed down the gangway. Solid ground felt foreign after nearly 2 weeks at sea. American military police, both men and women, processed them through a warehouse facility with surprising efficiency. They were photographed, fingerprinted, and given medical examinations by female army nurses who handled them with professional detachment, but no cruelty. Each woman received a numbered tag and a thin blanket. Then they were loaded onto olive green army trucks for the final leg of their journey. Fort Devens sat about 40 miles northwest of Boston, a sprawling military installation that had been expanded rapidly after America entered the war. The truck carrying Greta and 19 other women rolled through the main gates just as the winter sun was setting, casting long shadows across the neat rows of wooden barracks. They passed American soldiers drilling on parade grounds, supply trucks rumbling past, the organized chaos of a military base operating at full capacity. Finally, the truck stopped outside a smaller compound separated from the main base by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. This would be their new home. A tall American officer with captain's bars stood waiting as the women climbed down from the truck. He had a kind face, weathered and tired, and when he spoke, a female interpreter translated his words into German. Captain James Mitchell welcomed them to Fort Devens. He explained that they were prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. They would be housed in barracks, given work assignments, and treated with dignity as long as they followed camp rules. His tone was firm but not harsh, and Greta found herself surprised by the absence of hatred in his voice. She had expected her captors to see her as less than human. Instead, this American officer spoke to them as if they were simply soldiers who had ended up on the wrong side of a war. The women were led into a wooden barracks that smelled of fresh paint and pine. Rows of metal frame beds lined both walls, each with a thin mattress, 2 blankets, and a pillow. Compared to what they had endured in Belgium, compared to the ship's hold, it seemed almost comfortable. Greta chose a bed near the window and sat down carefully, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. The dinner bell rang at 1800 hours, a sound that would become as familiar as breathing in the months to come. The German women looked at each other uncertainly, still unsure of what to expect. A young American soldier, barely old enough to shave, appeared at the barracks door and gestured for them to follow. His uniform was clean and pressed, and he carried no weapon that Greta could see. This small detail struck her as strange. Where were the guards with rifles? Where was the intimidation she had been taught to expect from the enemy? They were led across the compound to a mess hall that stood separate from the main barracks. The building was larger than Greta had anticipated, with long tables arranged in neat rows and a serving line at one end. The smell hit her first, a rich aroma that made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. Tomatoes, garlic, meat cooking, bread baking. Her knees went weak, and she had to steady herself against the doorframe. When was the last time she had smelled food like this? Not the thin cabbage soup of the Wehrmacht rations, not the moldy bread of the ship's hold, but real food prepared with abundance and care. Sergeant Michael Romano stood behind the serving line, wearing a white apron over his uniform. He was a stocky man with dark hair and warm brown eyes, and his hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent his whole life around food. His family ran an Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, and he had been drafted into the army 2 years earlier. Now he served as head cook for this unusual prisoner of war facility, a job that suited him far better than carrying a rifle ever had. He looked up as the German women filed in, noting their gaunt faces, their hollow eyes, the way they moved with the careful deliberation of people who had learned not to expect good things. Through the interpreter, he explained the serving process. They would form a line, receive a plate and utensils, and the kitchen staff would serve them their meal. They could sit anywhere they liked. There was water and coffee available. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Greta joined the line, her heart pounding. She watched as the first woman reached the serving station and Romano ladled an enormous portion of spaghetti onto her plate. Then he added 3 large meatballs, each one perfectly browned and glistening with sauce. Then a thick slice of white bread with butter, then a portion of green beans. The woman stared at her plate as if it might disappear if she looked away. When Greta's turn came, she held out her plate with trembling hands. Romano smiled at her, a genuine warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and began filling her plate with the same generous portions. She wanted to say something, to ask if this was real, but no words came. She could only stare at the mountain of food he had given her, more than she would have eaten in 3 days back in Belgium. Greta carried her plate to the nearest table and sat down slowly, as if sudden movement might cause the food to vanish. Around her, the other German women were doing the same, each one settling into their seats with expressions that ranged from disbelief to suspicion. 53 pairs of eyes stared at 53 overflowing plates. No one touched their food. The silence in the mess hall was absolute, except for the clatter of dishes from the kitchen where Romano and his staff were cleaning up. Finally, a woman named Helene Becker, who had served as a senior communications officer and was the oldest among them at 34, picked up her fork. She was from Munich, the daughter of a factory owner, and had maintained an air of dignity even through capture and imprisonment. Now her hands shook as she twirled spaghetti around her fork, lifted it to her mouth, and took a single bite. Her eyes closed. A sound escaped her throat that was somewhere between a sob and a sigh. That was all the permission the others needed. Suddenly the mess hall filled with the sounds of eating, of forks scraping plates, of women who had been starving for months, finally allowing themselves to believe this bounty was real. Greta took her first bite and had to stop herself from weeping. The sauce was rich with tomatoes, garlic, herbs she couldn't identify. The meatballs were tender and seasoned perfectly, nothing like the gristly scraps that had occasionally appeared in Wehrmacht rations. The pasta itself was cooked just right, not the mushy, overcooked noodles she remembered from her childhood when times were hard. This was food prepared with skill and care, food meant to nourish and satisfy, not merely to keep a body barely functioning. She ate slowly at first, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but her body betrayed her. She was so hungry, so desperately, achingly hungry. About halfway through her plate, she had to stop. Her stomach, shrunken from months of deprivation, protested the sudden abundance. She sat back, breathing heavily, staring at the food she couldn't finish. Around her, other women were experiencing the same thing. Plates still half full, bodies unable to accept what their minds desperately wanted. It was a strange cruelty of starvation that even when food finally appeared, you couldn't eat your fill. Several women were crying quietly, overwhelmed by the generosity they couldn't fully accept, by the realization of just how hungry they had been, by the confusing kindness of their captors. Romano emerged from the kitchen and surveyed the scene with understanding in his eyes. He had seen this before with liberated concentration camp survivors, with refugees, with anyone who had known true hunger. Through the interpreter, he spoke gently to the room. "Don't force it. Your bodies need time. We'll have breakfast in the morning, and lunch, and dinner tomorrow night, every day, as much as you need." His words hung in the air like a promise that seemed too good to be true. Greta looked down at her still half-full plate and felt something crack open inside her chest. The first week passed in a haze of disbelief. 3 times a day, the dinner bell rang, and 3 times a day the German women filed into the mess hall to find generous portions waiting for them. Breakfast brought scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with real butter, and hot coffee that actually tasted like coffee. Lunch offered sandwiches made with thick slices of meat and cheese, fresh vegetables, and fruit that Greta hadn't seen since before the war. Dinner continued to feature Romano's Italian specialties alongside traditional American fare: pot roast, fried chicken, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy. Each meal felt like a small miracle. By the 4th day, most of the women could finish a full plate. Their bodies were adjusting, remembering what it meant to be nourished rather than merely sustained. Greta noticed color returning to faces that had been gray and drawn. Women who had moved slowly, conserving energy their bodies didn't have, now walked with something approaching normal vigor. The transformation was visible and undeniable. They were being fed not as prisoners, but as human beings worthy of care. What unsettled Greta most was the attitude of the American soldiers who worked at the facility. The young private who escorted them to meals, whose name she learned was Danny Morrison from Iowa, always held the mess hall door open for them. The guards who walked the perimeter of the compound carried rifles but spoke politely when they interacted with the prisoners. Captain Mitchell checked on them daily, asking through the interpreter if they had complaints or needs. This wasn't how enemies were supposed to behave. This wasn't what she had been taught about the ruthless Americans who sought to destroy Germany. On the 7th day, something shifted. Romano was serving lunch, beef stew with fresh bread, when one of the younger German women, a girl named Anna Weber, who couldn't have been more than 19, approached him hesitantly. She held out a piece of paper on which she had carefully written in broken English, "Thank you for food. Is very good." Her face flushed red with embarrassment at her poor language skills, but Romano's entire face lit up. He took the paper gently, read it, and then did something unexpected. He bowed slightly, placed his hand over his heart, and said "Prego," which the women would later learn meant "You're welcome" in Italian. That small exchange opened something that had been tightly closed. Other women began attempting English phrases, pointing to food and asking for the words. Romano was delighted to teach them. Spaghetti, meatballs, bread, butter. He would say each word slowly, encouraging them to repeat it. The lessons became a regular feature of mealtimes, with Romano's kitchen staff joining in, teaching vocabulary, and laughing gently at mispronunciations without mockery. Private Morrison started bringing a German-English dictionary his mother had sent him, hoping to learn their language in return. The mess hall, once a place of silent, wary eating, began to fill with the hesitant sounds of communication across the barrier of language and war. On the 10th day of their imprisonment, Captain Mitchell announced through the interpreter that the women would be permitted to write letters home to Germany. They would be subject to censorship, of course, but the Red Cross would ensure their delivery once mail routes were re-established after the war's end. The announcement sparked the first real emotional response Greta had seen from her fellow prisoners since their arrival. Women who had maintained stoic facades suddenly dissolved into tears. The possibility of contact with families they had left behind, with mothers and fathers and siblings who didn't know if they were alive or dead, was almost too much to bear. Greta sat in the barracks that evening with a sheet of paper and a pencil provided by the camp administration, staring at the blank page. What could she possibly say? How could she explain what she was experiencing? She began writing to her parents, her father the baker and her mother the schoolteacher, in their small Bavarian village. Dear Mama and Papa, I am alive and well. I am a prisoner of war in America, in a place called Massachusetts. She paused, chewing the end of her pencil. How could she describe the food without sounding like she had lost her mind? She continued carefully. They feed us 3 meals every day, real meals with meat and vegetables and bread. I know this sounds impossible, but it is true. Yesterday we had something called pot roast with potatoes and carrots. The day before, fried chicken. Today a stew with beef that reminded me of the one you used to make, Mama, but with more meat than we ever had. She stopped again, realizing how these words would sound to people who were likely starving in war-torn Germany. Would they think she was collaborating with the enemy? Would they understand? Around her, other women wrestled with similar struggles. Helene Becker was writing to her husband, who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and whose fate she didn't know. Anna Weber wrote to her mother and 3 younger sisters in Hamburg, a city she knew had been heavily bombed. Each woman tried to convey the strange reality of their situation, without betraying the confusion and guilt that came with being treated well by people they had been taught to hate. How do you tell your family that the enemy is kind? That your captors feed you better than your own government ever did? That you are safer and healthier as a prisoner than you were as a free woman serving the Reich? Greta finished her letter with words that felt inadequate. I think of you every day and pray that you are safe and have enough to eat. I pray the war ends soon so we can be together again. I am learning some English words. The Americans here are not what we were told. I do not know what this means. I love you both. Your daughter, Greta. She folded the letter carefully, knowing it would be read by censors before it ever left the camp, wondering if it would ever reach her parents at all, and, if it did, whether they would recognize their daughter in these confused and conflicted words. Trust, Greta discovered, didn't arrive all at once. It came in small increments, like coins dropped into a jar one at a time, until suddenly you looked down and realized you had accumulated something valuable. It came on the morning when Private Morrison noticed that Anna Weber had been coughing through the night and brought her hot tea with honey without being asked. It came when Sergeant Romano set aside extra bread for Helene Becker, who had mentioned through halting English that bread reminded her of home. It came in the way Captain Mitchell made sure the barracks were heated properly as winter deepened, checking personally that no one was cold during the frigid Massachusetts nights. By the 3rd week, the women had been assigned work duties. This was standard protocol for prisoner of war camps, and Greta had expected hard labor, punishment disguised as productivity. Instead, she found herself assigned to help in the camp library, organizing books and newspapers under the supervision of a middle-aged librarian named Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. The woman was civilian staff, the wife of a career Army officer, and she treated Greta with the same courteous professionalism she would have shown any assistant. She spoke slowly so Greta could understand, praised her work when she did well, and during quiet moments, taught her more English using the very books they were shelving. Other women received similarly reasonable assignments. Some worked in the laundry, others in the administrative offices doing filing and typing. A few with nursing experience were permitted to assist in the medical clinic under close supervision. Anna Weber, who had mentioned she once dreamed of being a teacher, was assigned to help in the education office where soldiers studied for advancement exams. The work was real but not grueling, purposeful but not punishing. They were being treated like contributors, rather than criminals. The mess hall continued to be the center of their daily lives. Romano had noticed which foods the women particularly enjoyed and began incorporating more of them into his menus. When he learned that several women were from Bavaria, he surprised them one evening with a dish he called goulash, his Italian-American interpretation of a German dish. It wasn't quite right, the spices were different, and he had added tomatoes in a way no German cook would have, but the gesture itself was so touching that several women cried openly. He had tried to give them a taste of home. It was during these mealtimes that the barriers began to truly break down. The German women and American soldiers started sitting at the same tables, communicating through broken English, improvised German, and elaborate hand gestures. Private Morrison showed photographs of his family farm in Iowa, pointing out his parents and siblings, his dog, the barn where he had done chores every morning before school. Greta found herself showing him the photograph she carried of her own family, and suddenly they weren't enemies anymore. They were just two young people far from home, caught up in circumstances neither had chosen, finding unexpected common ground in the simple human need for connection. Trust, she realized, was the space between propaganda and reality, and that space was growing wider every day. It was Sergeant Romano who first suggested that some of the German women might want to help in the kitchen. He approached Captain Mitchell with the idea in early April, about 6 weeks after the prisoners had arrived. The captain was initially hesitant, concerns about security and protocol weighing on his mind. But Romano was persuasive. "Sir, half these girls are homesick and the other half are bored. Let them cook. Let them teach us their recipes. Food is how people connect. It's how my Nana always said you turn strangers into family." Mitchell had eventually agreed, with the stipulation that the women would work under constant supervision and that all knives would be counted and locked away at the end of each shift. Greta was among the first to volunteer. Her father's bakery had been her second home growing up, and she knew her way around a kitchen better than she knew military protocols. Romano welcomed her and 3 other women, Helene, Anna, and a quiet girl named Margaretha Stein who had worked in her family's restaurant in Berlin before the war. That first morning in the kitchen, Romano showed them where everything was kept, explained his systems, and then asked a question that surprised them all. "What can you teach me to make?" The women looked at each other uncertainly. Margaretha spoke first, her English improving daily. "You want us to cook German food?" Romano nodded enthusiastically. "I want to learn everything. My restaurant back home, we only do Italian. But food is food. Good cooking is good cooking. Show me what you know." It was a small thing, this request, but it represented something much larger. He was acknowledging that they had value, that their culture and knowledge were worth learning rather than destroying. He was treating them as teachers rather than prisoners. They started with something simple, potato pancakes that Margaretha's grandmother had made every Sunday. Romano watched carefully as she grated potatoes, mixed in eggs and flour, seasoned with salt and pepper. When the first pancake hit the hot pan and the familiar smell filled the kitchen, Margaretha's eyes filled with tears. She had not smelled that scent since leaving Berlin, since before the bombs started falling, since before everything fell apart. Romano noticed, but said nothing, simply placing a gentle hand on her shoulder for a moment before returning to his observation of her technique. The pancakes were served at dinner that evening as a side dish alongside Romano's chicken. The announcement that they had been made by the German prisoners, using a traditional recipe, sparked unexpected interest among the American soldiers. Men who had never given much thought to what they were eating suddenly paid attention. They asked questions through interpreters. Where in Germany did this recipe come from? What other dishes did they know? One soldier from Pennsylvania mentioned that his grandmother, who had immigrated from Germany before the war, used to make something similar. Suddenly, the mess hall was filled with conversations about food, about heritage, about the recipes that connected people across oceans and generations. In that moment, the German women were no longer just prisoners. They were cooks, teachers, keepers of culinary traditions that deserved respect and preservation. The kitchen became a bridge between two worlds. Every few days, Romano would ask the German women to teach him another dish. They made sauerbraten, though they had to substitute ingredients and adjust the recipe to work with what the American military commissary could provide. They made spätzle, the small egg noodles that Romano declared were almost like Italian pasta, but with their own distinct character. They made apple strudel using a dough technique that required patience and skill, stretching it thin enough to read through. Romano watched everything with the intense focus of a man who understood that cooking was both art and science. But the exchange wasn't one-sided. Romano began teaching the women his own family recipes. He showed them how to make proper marinara sauce the way his grandmother had taught him, with San Marzano tomatoes and fresh basil and a patience that couldn't be rushed. He taught them to make risotto, explaining how you had to add the stock slowly, stirring constantly, treating the rice with respect. He showed them his mother's recipe for braciole, thin beef rolled around a filling of breadcrumbs, cheese, and herbs. The German women took notes in small notebooks that Mrs. Hayes had provided from the library, writing down measurements and techniques in a mixture of German and English, creating documents that would become treasured possessions in the years to come. Greta found herself thinking about her father's bakery more and more. She asked Romano if she might be permitted to bake bread, real German bread, the dense rye and whole grain loaves that her father had specialized in. Romano's eyes lit up. "Bread is sacred," he said. "My family, we never buy bread from a store, always make it ourselves. Show me your father's way." He arranged for the right types of flour to be requisitioned, found a source for caraway seeds, and cleared space in the baking schedule for Greta's experiments. The first loaf she pulled from the oven was imperfect. The crust was slightly too dark, and the interior not quite as dense as her father would have made it. But the smell, that rich, yeasty smell of fresh-baked bread, transported her instantly back to childhood mornings in Bavaria. She stood in the kitchen of an American military prison and sobbed, holding a hot loaf of bread against her chest, overwhelmed by the gift Romano had given her without even realizing it. He had given her back a piece of her identity, a connection to who she had been before the war, before the propaganda, before everything had gone so terribly wrong. The bread was served at dinner, sliced thick, and offered alongside butter. American soldiers who had grown up on soft white sandwich bread found themselves surprised by the hearty, flavorful density of proper German rye. Many came back for seconds. Private Morrison told Greta through halting German that it reminded him of bread his grandmother used to make, that his family had come from Germany 3 generations ago, that he had never thought about that connection until now. Food, Greta realized, had its own language that transcended war and politics. In the kitchen, creating and sharing meals, they weren't Germans and Americans, they were simply people, honoring the traditions that made them human. The shift happened so gradually that no one could pinpoint exactly when it occurred. One day the American soldiers were guards and the German women were prisoners, and then somehow, imperceptibly, they became something else. It started with names. Private Morrison stopped being the guard and became Danny. Sergeant Romano was just Romano, or sometimes Mike when he was in a particularly good mood. The German women stopped being a faceless group of enemies and became Greta, Anna, Helene, Margaretha. Individual people with stories and personalities and quirks that made them memorable. Danny Morrison had a particular talent for making people laugh despite the language barrier. He would act out elaborate pantomimes during his guard shifts, pretending to be various animals or doing exaggerated impressions of officers. The German women would gather to watch, giggling behind their hands at his antics. He taught them American slang that probably wasn't appropriate for formal language lessons, words and phrases that made them feel like they were learning the real language people actually spoke rather than the textbook version. Anna Weber, whose English had improved the fastest of all the prisoners, became something of a social coordinator. She organized informal gatherings in the mess hall after dinner where Germans and Americans would play cards or simple games that didn't require much language. She convinced Captain Mitchell to allow music, and suddenly the evening hours filled with songs from both sides of the Atlantic. American soldiers taught the women, "You are my sunshine," and "Oh, Susanna." The German women sang folk songs from their childhoods, melodies that spoke of forests and rivers and a Germany that had existed before the nightmare of the Nazi regime. Helene Becker, with her organizational skills and natural authority, became an unofficial liaison between the prisoners and the camp administration. Captain Mitchell found himself relying on her to communicate complex information to the other women, to help resolve minor disputes, to ensure that the daily routines ran smoothly. She took the responsibility seriously, understanding that she was building trust that could benefit all the women in the camp. Her dignity and competence earned her respect from both sides. Even the guards who didn't work directly with the prisoners began to see them differently. The women were no longer abstract enemies, but the girls who made that incredible bread, who sang beautifully during the evening gatherings, who had shared recipes and stories and photographs of their families. When new guards arrived at the facility, they were often surprised by the atmosphere they found. This didn't look like other POW camps they had heard about. There was structure and security, yes, but there was also something that looked almost like community. Greta watched all of this unfold with a mixture of wonder and confusion. She had been taught that Americans were monsters, that they would show no mercy to their enemies. Instead, she had found people who treated her with kindness, who valued her skills, who saw her as a human being worthy of respect. The cognitive dissonance was sometimes overwhelming. Late at night, writing in her diary by lamplight, she tried to make sense of what was happening. "I came here as a prisoner," she wrote, "but I am beginning to wonder if I am actually becoming free." May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe was officially over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The news spread through Fort Devens like wildfire, and the American soldiers erupted in celebration. Cheers echoed across the compound. Men embraced each other. Some cried with relief that they wouldn't be shipping out to combat zones. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally ending, at least on one front. For the German women prisoners, the news brought a complicated tangle of emotions. Relief that the killing would stop. Fear about what had become of their homeland. Uncertainty about what their surrender meant for their own futures. Captain Mitchell gave them the day to process the news privately. No work assignments, no required activities. The women gathered in small groups in the barracks, speaking in hushed German, trying to understand what came next. Would they be sent home immediately? Would there even be homes to return to? Reports from Germany spoke of cities reduced to rubble, of infrastructure destroyed, of a population on the brink of starvation. Greta thought about her parents in their small Bavarian village and prayed they had survived. She thought about her father's bakery and wondered if it still stood. That evening, Romano did something unprecedented. He asked Captain Mitchell for permission to prepare a special dinner, a feast that would mark the end of the war. Mitchell agreed, understanding that food could serve a ceremonial purpose that speeches and proclamations could never match. Romano enlisted all 4 German women who worked in the kitchen, and together they planned a meal that would honor both sides of the conflict. They would make both American and German dishes, a celebration of the possibility of peace. The preparation took all day. They made Romano's grandmother's lasagna, layers of pasta and meat and cheese that required hours of careful assembly. They made Greta's father's bread recipe, multiple loaves baked until the whole kitchen smelled like a Bavarian bakery. They made potato salad using Margaretha's family recipe, sauerbraten using techniques Helene remembered from her childhood, apple cake that Anna's mother used to make for special occasions. They made roasted chicken and vegetables, fresh salads, and 3 different kinds of dessert. It was more food than the mess hall had ever seen, a display of abundance that seemed almost defiant in the face of all the deprivation the war had brought. When the German women and American soldiers filed into the mess hall that evening, they stopped in the doorway, stunned by what they saw. Tables had been pushed together and covered with white sheets. Candles had been lit. Platters of food covered every available surface. Romano stood at the center of it all, his white apron stained with the evidence of hours of work, and he gestured for everyone to sit together. Not prisoners and guards, not enemies. just people sharing a meal. As they ate, passing dishes back and forth, complimenting the cooks, some laughing while others cried quietly, Greta understood that this was what peace could look like. Not a treaty or a surrender, but people choosing to sit together at the same table and break bread. 3 days after VE Day, Captain Mitchell called a meeting with all 53 German women prisoners. He stood before them in the mess hall, his face serious but not unkind, and through the interpreter, he delivered news that would force each woman to make the most important decision of her life. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention and the armistice agreements, they would be repatriated to Germany as soon as transportation could be arranged. They would be going home. The silence that followed his announcement was deafening. Going home, the words should have brought relief, joy, celebration. Instead, they brought a wave of conflicting emotions that left many of the women sitting frozen in their seats. Home to what? The reports from Germany painted a picture of utter devastation. Cities destroyed by Allied bombing. Infrastructure collapsed. Millions of people displaced or dead. Food shortages that made wartime rationing look generous by comparison. The Nazi government that had sent them to war had fallen, and what remained was chaos and uncertainty. But Mitchell wasn't finished. He cleared his throat and continued, his words carefully chosen. For those women who wished to remain in the United States, there might be a possibility. It was unprecedented, highly irregular, and would require extensive paperwork and approvals from multiple government agencies. But the United States was considering allowing certain German prisoners of war, those who had demonstrated good conduct and posed no security threat, to apply for immigration status. It would not be automatic, it would not be easy, but it would be possible. The room erupted in whispered conversations. The interpreter could barely keep up as women shouted questions in German. How long would the process take? What would they be allowed to do while they waited? Could they bring family members over later? Would they be allowed to work, to own property, to become citizens? Mitchell raised his hands for quiet and explained what he knew. The details were still being worked out. Nothing was guaranteed. But for those interested, applications would be available within the week. They would have time to think, to decide what they truly wanted. That night, the barracks buzzed with debate that lasted until dawn. Some women knew immediately that they wanted to return to Germany despite the hardships waiting there. Their families were there, their identities were there, and they couldn't imagine building lives anywhere else. Others were equally certain they wanted to stay in America, drawn by the opportunities they sensed here, by the kindness they had experienced, by the possibility of starting fresh without the weight of Germany's shame hanging over them. But most fell somewhere in the middle, torn between loyalty to their homeland and attraction to their new circumstances. Greta lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning through possibilities. She thought about her parents, about whether they were even alive. She thought about the bakery that had shaped her childhood. But she also thought about the library where she worked, about Mrs. Hayes who treated her with respect, about Romano's kitchen where she had rediscovered joy in creating food. She thought about a future in America versus a future in defeated Germany, and she realized she had no idea which version of home she truly wanted. The applications were distributed on May 15th. 27 women requested them. 26 decided they would return to Germany. The division cut through friendships that had formed during captivity, creating a bittersweet atmosphere in the barracks. Women who had supported each other through the hardest months of their lives now faced separation, possibly forever. There were no hard feelings, just sadness that circumstances were forcing them onto different paths. Each woman respected the other's choices, understanding that there were no easy answers, no clearly right decisions. Greta spent 3 days staring at the blank application before she finally began filling it out. Her hand shook as she wrote her name, her birth date, her place of origin. The questions seemed designed to excavate every detail of her past. Had she been a member of the Nazi Party? No. Women weren't permitted membership, though she had been part of organizations affiliated with it. Had she committed any war crimes? The question made her stomach clench. She had been a radio operator, passing along communications. Had any of those messages led to deaths? She didn't know, and the not knowing haunted her. She answered truthfully as she could and hoped it would be enough. Anna Weber had already submitted her application, one of the first to do so. Her decision had been swift and certain. There was nothing left for her in Hamburg. Her father had died in the early years of the war. Her mother and sisters, if they had survived the bombing, would be struggling in ways Anna couldn't bear to imagine. Here in America, she saw possibility. She had been offered a position to train as a nurse at a hospital in Worcester once her status was resolved. She wanted to help people, to spend her life making amends for the destruction her country had caused. America would give her that chance. Helene Becker chose repatriation. Her husband was somewhere in Germany, assuming he had survived, and she needed to find him. Her sense of duty to her marriage, to her past, outweighed the attractions of America. But she told Greta privately that the choice was harder than she had expected. 6 months ago, I would have laughed at the idea of wanting to stay in enemy territory, she said quietly. Now I understand that the real enemy was never a nation or a people. It was the ideology that taught us to hate. On June 1st, the day before the first group would depart for repatriation, Romano organized one final dinner. He called it a farewell feast, though the word felt inadequate for what it truly meant. The women who were staying helped prepare dishes alongside those who were leaving. They made all the recipes they had shared over the past months. German and American and Italian all mixed together on the same tables. The mess hall filled with the scents of bread and roasted meat and herbs, with the sounds of laughter mixed with tears, with the complicated joy of people who had found unexpected connection in the most unlikely circumstances. As they ate together one last time, Greta looked around at faces that had become dear to her. American soldiers who had become friends. German women who had become sisters. This strange little community that had formed in the space between war and peace. Tomorrow some would leave and some would stay, but tonight they were all still together, sharing food and gratitude for what they had survived and what they had learned. The trucks came at dawn on June 2nd. 26 women boarded with their small bags of belongings, heading to the port in Boston, where ships would carry them back across the Atlantic to a Germany they barely recognized from the reports. Tears flowed freely on both sides. Helene embraced Greta for a long moment, whispering, in German, that she hoped they would meet again someday. Anna clung to friends who had chosen differently, promising to write, to never forget. The American soldiers who had worked with these women stood at attention as the trucks pulled away, many of them openly emotional at the departure of people who had somehow become more than just prisoners. 27 women remained behind. They moved into a different barracks, one designated for those awaiting immigration processing. Their status existed in a strange limbo. No longer prisoners of war exactly, but not yet free civilians. They were permitted to work for wages now, small amounts that were deposited into accounts they could access once their status was finalized. The change was subtle but significant. They were being treated as future Americans rather than defeated enemies. Greta continued working in the library, but now Mrs. Hayes paid her a small salary and began training her in more complex cataloging systems. "You have a mind for organization," Mrs. Hayes told her one afternoon. "Have you considered library science as a career? There are colleges that teach it. Once your status is settled, you could apply." The idea that she might go to college in America, that she might have a professional career, seemed almost fantastical. But Mrs. Hayes spoke about it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if Greta's German origins and prisoner past were mere biographical details rather than defining limitations. Anna began her nursing training under the supervision of the camp medical officer, Dr. Richard Chen. He was the older brother of the sergeant who had taught them English in the early days, and he shared his brother's patient teaching style. Anna proved to be a natural, her gentle manner with patience and quick learning, impressing everyone who worked with her. Dr. Chen told Captain Mitchell that Anna would make an excellent nurse, that any hospital would be lucky to have her. Coming from a man whose parents had immigrated from China and faced their own prejudice, the endorsement carried extra weight. Romano offered Greta a proposition one evening after dinner service. His family wanted to expand their restaurant in Brooklyn after the war, and he thought she could help. "You know German baking. I know Italian cooking. We could create something special, something that brings different traditions together. Would you consider it? Once your papers come through?" Greta stared at him, overwhelmed by the offer. He was inviting her not just to work for him, but to be a partner in creation, to contribute her heritage and skills to something new. The women who stayed did so for many reasons. Some had no family left in Germany. Some couldn't face returning to the shame and destruction waiting there. But increasingly, Greta understood that they stayed for something more fundamental than escaping hardship. They stayed because, in America, in this strange prisoner of war camp that had become something else entirely, they had discovered they could be valued for who they were, rather than where they came from. They stayed because America, despite all its flaws, offered second chances. The immigration approvals came through in stages over the following year. Anna was among the first, her application expedited due to the nursing shortage at Worcester General Hospital. She moved into a small apartment near the hospital in October of 1945 and sent Greta a letter describing her first day of work as a real American nurse. "I wore a crisp white uniform, and everyone called me Miss Weber," she wrote. "No one treats me like an enemy. They treat me like a colleague. Like I belong here." She included a photograph of herself standing in front of the hospital, smiling with a confidence Greta had never seen in her during their prisoner days. Greta's approval came in January of 1946. By then she had saved enough from her library wages to buy a train ticket to New York City. Romano had been writing to his family about her for months, and they welcomed her into their Brooklyn restaurant with open arms. His mother, a formidable woman named Maria who barely reached 5 feet tall, hugged Greta fiercely and declared in broken English that any friend of her son's was family. The restaurant, a small storefront called Romano's, became Greta's new home. She worked alongside the family, learning their recipes while teaching them hers, creating fusion dishes that delighted customers looking for something different in the post-war dining scene. Within 2 years, they had expanded the menu to include a German section, specialties that Greta developed based on her father's recipes but adapted to American ingredients and tastes. The bread became legendary in the neighborhood. People would line up on Saturday mornings for Greta's fresh-baked rye and pumpernickel, loaves that reminded immigrant families of the old country while introducing American-born children to flavors their grandparents had known. Romano's became known as the place where Italian and German cuisines met and created something new, something that could only exist in America. Other women from the camp found their own paths. Margaretha opened a small bakery in Boston, specializing in German pastries and wedding cakes. She married an American soldier she had met at Fort Devens, a sweet-natured man from Vermont who had fallen in love with her quiet competence and her incredible skill with dough. 3 women moved to Pennsylvania, where large German immigrant communities existed from before the war, finding acceptance among people who understood the language and culture, even if they didn't always understand the choice to come as former prisoners. The women stayed in contact through letters, creating a network of mutual support that spanned the eastern seaboard. They shared recipes and advice, news of marriages and children, reflections on their extraordinary journey from enemies to immigrants. When Anna got engaged to a doctor at her hospital in 1948, Greta traveled to Worcester for the wedding and baked the cake herself, a traditional German torte that made Anna cry when she saw it. When Margaretha had her first child, a daughter she named Maria, after Romano's mother, Greta became the baby's godmother. They had arrived in America as prisoners, sustained by spaghetti and meatballs that seemed too generous to be real. They had stayed because of kindness shown through food, through portions that spoke of abundance rather than scarcity. But they built their lives around American tables, not because of what they had been given, but because of what they had been allowed to become. They found freedom not in the absence of captivity, but in the presence of opportunity. 25 years after that first dinner at Fort Devens, Greta stood in the kitchen of what had become Romano's and Weber's restaurant, a thriving establishment in Brooklyn that seated over 100 guests. She had become a full partner in the business, her name on the sign, her recipes as central to the menu as the Romano family's Italian traditions. She was 47 years old, an American citizen for 2 decades, fluent in English, though she never quite lost her accent. She had never married, pouring her energy instead into the restaurant and into preserving the culinary heritage that had saved her life. That evening, a special reunion had been organized. Captain Mitchell, now retired and living in Maine, had made the trip down. Danny Morrison came from Iowa with his wife and 3 children. Mrs. Hayes traveled from Massachusetts, elderly now but still sharp-minded. Sergeant Romano, who everyone still called by his rank, even though the war had been over for 25 years, hosted them all in his restaurant, with his son Michael Jr. helping in the kitchen. Anna came from Worcester with her husband and 2 teenage daughters. Margaretha arrived from Boston with her 4 children. 11 of the 27 women who had chosen to stay gathered around tables pushed together, just like that Last Supper at Fort Devens. They shared stories late into the night, laughing about the early days when communication had been nearly impossible, crying as they remembered friends who hadn't survived the intervening years. They toasted Helene, who had returned to Germany, found her husband alive, and spent decades working for German-American friendship organizations. They honored the memory of 2 women from their group who had passed away, one from illness and one in a car accident. They celebrated the children and grandchildren who represented the future they had chosen, American kids with German names and mixed heritage who would never fully understand what their mothers and grandmothers had survived. Captain Mitchell gave a short speech, his voice wavering with emotion. "I didn't know what to do with you ladies when you first arrived. The regulations said one thing but my conscience said another. I'm grateful I listened to the latter. You proved that treating people with dignity and offering them second chances isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing a nation can do." Romano raised his glass and added in his gruff way, "My nana always said, you can tell the measure of people by how they treat strangers at their table. America got that one right with you ladies." Greta thought about that first plate of spaghetti and meatballs, portions so large she had been certain it was a mistake. She thought about the hunger she had known and the abundance she had found. But mostly she thought about the generosity that had changed everything, not just the food itself, but what the food represented. A willingness to see enemies as human beings, a commitment to nourishment over punishment, a belief that people could change, could grow, could become something better than what circumstances had made them. She stood and raised her own glass, speaking in English that was now as natural to her as German. "We came here as prisoners. You fed us as guests. You treated us as friends. You allowed us to become Americans. That generosity, that willingness to offer more than we deserved, that is what we have tried to pass forward. Through food, through kindness, through remembering that everyone deserves a place at the table."